everybody. I'm Manaswi, and today we'll be discussing American susceptibility to Russian disinformation. So think about warfare. When the warfare comes to your mind, what do you think of? You think of guns, you think of bombs, you think of aircraft and aircraft carriers, right? But the most common type of warfare is actually information warfare. What is information warfare? Information warfare is when essentially a foreign or a hostile country is trying to use information, disinformation, or fake news in order to destabilize your population and cause chaos in the country. Russia has a long history of waging information warfare against the United States going back to 2014. And this is especially powerful because information warfare is extremely cheap to implement. You can pay like $100 a day to a bunch of guys in a dark room, and they're sending out like fake news on Facebook and Twitter, and this is very cheap. And it's also highly scalable because fake news has a way of spreading, like a contagion, like a virus, right? People love to share fake news on social media. And lastly, it's indefensible without having mass censorship. So, it's very difficult to detect fake news, but once you start mass banning it, people say, oh, you're getting censored. So there are some deadly consequences to this, such as COVID-19 disinformation, which led to thousands of people dying from fake news. 2016 election interference, which reduced public trust in our voting system and also led to a series of shootings and riots. And January 6th insurrection, where a lot of conspiracy theories led to kind of literally an insurrection on the Capitol. So America has been unable to deal with this, and so the question I'm trying to investigate is how susceptible the American public was to disinformation campaigns and what can we do about it. So obviously this is a very big question, so I want to narrow down the scope of the research project. I started out by studying America in particular because it's a democracy with a large population of greater than 300 million people. American people have high social media and internet usage compared to the rest of the world, so it's good to study social media usage. And we are a long geopolitical and military threat to Russia. I use Twitter as a platform because it has a huge user base, 460 million people. Discussions are centered around politics, and it's easily filtered through hashtags. And it's historically been used by Russia for disinformation campaigns, so there's a long trail of that. And I chose to study Ukrainian invasion disinformation in particular because Russians have been actively spreading disinformation as early as this morning. So the methods that I used is that essentially it's very difficult to use humans to comb through all the disinformation. Imagine how many tweets are published in a day. So we have to use more automated means. And the way that I used was deep learning. We use deep learning to study patterns in language, so identify if a tweet is Russian disinformation, but also to investigate how Americans responded to that disinformation, whether they were pro, against, whether they liked it, whether they were influenced by it. And we use some pre-existing code bases like NLTK, and these are just like chunks of code that you can put into Twitter and it spits out like how people are influenced. And lastly, there were some limitations, significant ones in our research study due to funding issues. And one is we had a small data set of 100 users compared to 460 million users. And we only were able to look at a single point in time. So August 15, 4 p.m. is when we collected the data. So we can speak to that period. And we cannot definitively verify human users because there are bots all the time on social media. Finally, we can't account if the people that are expressing to the Americans on the platform are actually Americans or they're just like people using VPNs and ways to mask their identity. These are the results that are extremely important. What you want to focus on, this site represents the kind of nature of the disinformation. The sentiment represents how the disinformation has been spread. Positive means it's pro-Russian. Negative means it's anti-Ukrainian, so it's like talking smack on Ukrainians. And neutral means it's trying to be as balanced as possible. And there are several counts of that. This over here is how Americans responded. Polarity represents like whether they responded negatively, which is negative, or positively, which is positive. And subjectivity means how, on average, how opinionated the fake news was. And what is important to note is this cluster right here. Most of the data is over here, but you'll see some significant ones over here in the top right corner. So in conclusion, from the Russian disinformation strategy, they had a very subtle way of spreading disinformation. It was designed to be as neutral as possible, as you can see from the previous cluster on the left. It was also designed to be more pro-Russia than anti-Ukraine. And Americans had a very polarized reaction to that. Most Americans were apathetic to Russian disinformation, and some Americans, some subsegments were more susceptible than others, and this is very important. And conspiracy-like disinformation was the most effective tool on Americans. So the takeaways from our study is very important. Russian disinformation is still in its nascent and ineffective stage. Overall effect was very minimal, but it's getting better. And we need to, if we're going to solve this issue, we need to focus on certain groups and disinformation types. So people who tend to fall more into older categories, tend to be more right of center in terms of politics, tend to be more vulnerable to these types of disinformation. And disinformation that are more conspiratorial in nature tend to be more effective. So we need to focus on cracking down on those. And there are many applications. As you can see, this is very important because it helps us analyze the strategies that our enemies are using against us. Second, it helps lawmakers come up with sensible policy on controlling disinformation. And lastly, it's helping people really get the resources they need, because there are so many people, we don't have time to give them individual attention, but if we have data, we can make data-driven decisions and prioritize which ones we're helping first. And in the future, I plan to get funding from Department of Defense and DARPA to model changes and public reactions over time. Again, this was just a snapshot study, but we want to see if these people change over time. Typically, if you're reading misinformation, you're not going to be changed by one tweet, but you're going to be changed by a segment of tweets over time. So we want to model those changes. We also want to break down this American population by political affiliation, by age demographics, by gender, try to see if Russians are targeting one demographic or another. And lastly, we want to analyze larger data sets across multiple countries so we can get a more global perspective on this. Thank you, and if you have any questions, reach out to me at my email below.